This is another iRaw podcast.
Hello, I'm Amelia Lease, and welcome to Season 4 of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to my book entitled Think Like a Vegan, which is also available in paperback and audiobook. My guests today are brothers Vasile and James Stănescu, and we'll be talking about the sanitized idea of nature without so-called invasive species and the violent ground that kind of rhetoric sets up for both human and non-human animals. James is one of the editors of a book entitled The Ethics and Rhetoric of Invasion Ecology, which is also edited by Kevin Cummings and is published by Lexington Books. So welcome, Vasile and James. It's great to have you here. I'm really thrilled that you're here because, actually, I'll let you say hi and then I'll go into my spiel because I am quite excited that you're here. So
we're thrilled to be here. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for having us so much.
Before we hear from James and Vasile, I want to tell you a little bit about them and read an extract from each of their contributions to the Invasion Ecology book. Vasile holds a PhD from Stanford University and is an associate professor of communication at Mercer University. He became vegetarian at the age of 9 and vegan at university, and he's been vegan now for over 20 years. He's been publishing work on effective animal liberation for over a decade. And here's the extract from Vasile's contribution, The Judas Pig, on the eradication of feral pigs on Santa Cruz Island. And you'll hear us discussing more about that in the show. Vasile writes, the, quote, overpopulation of feral pigs was in large part caused by the killing or removal of feral sheep that were originally considered the worst ecological problem. Once there were no more sheep to compete for resources, it helped to cause the feral pig explosion, i.e. managing, all these have air quotes around them, mind you, and killing off one species leads to more managing and more killing. In other words, animals had to be exterminated to protect animals. Nature had to be violated in order to protect nature. And James is an assistant professor of communication studies at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. They work together, and you'll hear more about that too later. He too is vegan and has been writing about animal liberation for over a decade as well. Can I just say, how cool is that to have brothers who are both vegan, both working towards animal liberation, and who also work together? That's just super cool. And back to the good stuff. This is the extract from James's contribution to Invasion Ecology. He writes, when one looks at how non-native animals are eliminated, with dogs, aerial hunting, bounties, electronic and even chemical trackers on animals, gridded lands, and a variety of very powerful weapons, it can seem that those who are in the business of eradicating introduced species are going to war, perhaps even fighting an insurgency conflict, rather than engaging in wildlife management. Indeed, whatever the environmental effects of non-native animals, one has to contend with the fact that it is an issue often spoken of in the most apocalyptic tones and terminology. The hyperbolic communication around non-native species allows us only hyperbolic reactions. Such reactions dictate that the only relationship to non-native species that we can have is either permanent war or total eradication. In other words, the hyperbolic communication around non-native species allows us only hyperbolic reactions. And both of these extracts really set the stage for our discussion here. Vasile and James, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm James Stănescu, and I'm here with my brother, which is our first podcast together as brothers. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for having us. I was just going to say a little bit about how the book came about, why I wanted to edit it, and some thoughts there. And then we'll pass it to Vas to talk a little bit about some of the contents in it. So I did my dissertation on the factory farm, which is a fairly straightforward moral abomination. It does not require a lot of complexity to show that the factory farm is terrible. Most people just spend their time doing their best not to think about it. So it's really, as Derrida calls it, the great forgetting, right? So it's really not a hard thing to convince people, oh, this is bad. But the way that people try to get around the terribleness of their day in and day out relationship to other animals, particularly through the domination of eating them, is to try to come up with any kind of excuse about why it would ever be okay to ever possibly kill an animal, with the idea that seems to be, and I used to be a moral philosopher, so it doesn't make any sense to me, but with the idea that seems to be if you could justify theoretically one case to kill an animal, suddenly something like the factory farm becomes okay. So I would do these talks about the factory farm as I was working through my dissertation and publishing articles out of it later on. And people would basically always go, yes, but of course, what about invasive species? And I honestly didn't know much about invasive species. And my general thought was, well, that's really sort of an aside. This is we're talking about 99% of the kinds of meats they want to eat. If you are occasionally hunting an invasive species, that just seems not really what our conversation's about. But did cause me ultimately to begin looking into it. And I was shocked to find out how divided actually many people were on the questions about non-native species, about what their effects were to the environment. Were they actually causing harms to the environment? And that overwhelmingly, the feeling was that, it's very hard to model harms to the environment. For the most part, non-native species increase ecological diversity. They don't tend to decrease ecological diversity. That's even more true when we're talking about mammals. There are exceptions. Carnivores on islands tend to be a bit of a problem. But in general, it's not this, as soon as you're a non-native species, you're obviously going to consume the entire biomass around you. And that's just this very bizarre thing. And then this other thing happened. So as I was looking at this, I came across this article from Banu, what was it? The aliens have landed is what it's called. And she makes this argument, and she has an essay in our edited volume, and we were very happy she came and gave us one. But she makes this argument that the rhetoric of non-native species, that they overpopulate, that they can't be controlled, that they are their appetites are too much, are very racialized in very obvious ways. There's a very anti-immigrant and xenophobic rhetoric that we're then projecting deeply onto other animals. And we're doing two things at once. We're naturalizing our own racisms, our own xenophobias, right? We're justifying our relationship to other humans that are in terrible, awful ways and saying, look, that's just the way the world is. Of course, there are terrible, people just overpopulate. That's just the way the world is, So on one hand, we're doing that. And then, of course, we're also justifying this relationship to non-native species. And we're going back and forth. We're using xenophobia to attack non-native species. And then we're using that naturalizing maneuver this rhetorical naturalizing maneuver to justify our policies and our violences against other humans as well. And so we wanted to collect a variety of essays from leading scholars. At the point when we started this book, there was very little in critical animal studies, very little in animal studies at all on non-native species. Since then, there's been a lot of work that's come out. A lot of it's very good. But I'm still very proud of this initial edited volume. And we wanted a bunch of different looks at these entwined questions. How is it that our rhetorics and our relationships to non-native species matter to other humans, and how is it that our policies around other humans also go and often impact non-native species? And then I have this weird thing where I call my brother all the time, and now we work together. But at this point in time, we're living pretty far apart. And I was like, well, I'm working on this book. And he's like, I'm working on a chapter on that question. And I said, well, I don't know if it'd be weird for you, but we love to have it. And so Vas produced this really great chapter on post-commodity fetishism, and some of the original sorts of justifications by people like Michael Pollan about why we should, why invasive animals are a problem. And so I'm going to turn over to Vas to talk a little bit about his article and a little bit more about the contents of that now.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And this is our first podcast together, but I hope one of many. I grew up listening to Car Talk in the United States on NPR, which was two brothers who diagnosed cars, but mainly laughed and told jokes. And they always ended, "Don't drive like my brother, don't drive like my brother." So I've been trying to sell James on doing a podcast together where we end, "Don't eat meat like my brother, don't eat meat like my brother." Because I don't know how many, maybe that's the wrong way to phrase it, I don't know, but I don't know how many, vegan animal rights activists, academics who work together as brothers are out there. And I think it's an important story.
I'm sure there are tons, man. Tons.
The vegan bros, yes.
Yes.
And I get, he has a blog, Critical Animal Studies blog, and I get complimented on my blog all the time. I mean, and I have to say, oh no, that's my brother's blog. But briefly about the chapter. So I went in sort of the opposite side. So James mentioned that he focused on the factory farm. And so I focused on the opposite extreme of the factory farm. So humane meat, local raised meat. There's, of course, a host of different terms, compassionate carnivores. I've gone on to focus on things like hybrid meat, lab-grown meat. So all these sort of cases where the ethics seem confusing to some, where even vegans and animal rights activists actually sometimes support and argue for them. And so this was invasive species came part of that. And what stood out to me is I was reading Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, and he makes this argument that there is a tension between environmentalism and animal rights. And to prove the supposed tension between environmentalism and animal rights, he gives one specific example, and that example is the killing of feral pigs on Santa Cruz Island. Donna Haraway wrote a book, When Species Meet. She's a very famous theorist out of UC Santa Cruz, and she makes a similar argument that there is a supposed tension between environmentalism and animal rights, and her proof of this example is, again, feral pigs in Santa Cruz, not the island, but the area, but still the same species to make the same argument. And then there's an entire novel by T.C. Boyle called When the Killing is Done, which argues that there's a tension between animal rights and environmentalism and gives the example to prove it, the killing of these pigs on Santa Cruz Island. And so across the culture, it seemed to me that one example was being used to prove a supposed tension between environmentalism and animal rights. My two areas of research are environmental. I'm actually trained in environmental ethics and critical animal studies. And so this is the example. I was like, okay, well, I have to take a look and see, is there a there in this argument that somehow there's a fundamental tension between environmentalism and animal rights? I mean, people try to argue for eating meat and they can't really come up with a reason. And oddly, strangely, ironically, the reason they come up with is environmentalism. even though everything I've ever studied environmentalism, every peer-reviewed study I've ever read, suggests exactly the opposite. That is one of the single most destructive planets, second in greenhouse gas emissions after fossil fuels. And so at a base level, what the chapter reveals, in almost kind of an investigative journalism way, is that the claim that they needed to kill these feral pigs on Santa Cruz to protect biodiversity and specifically to save these foxes that were endangered was just a made-up lie for marketing. So even before we get into any kind of theoretical argument, this iconic touchstone that's used over and over again to suggest that there is a tension between environmentalism and animal rights is just based on a lie used for marketing, which has just been widely admitted by even people who helped to originally write the reports to justify the killing. And so what was actually occurring is the Nature Conservancy, which is this massive nonprofit. Yes, it's a nonprofit, but it correctly has been described as like Big Green or as like a nonprofit corporation because it is so wealthy, has so many assets, owned these islands largely in conjunction with the National Park, but the Nature Conservancy owned most of them. And they wanted something that looked like nature. And these feral pigs didn't match their image of what pristine nature was supposed to look like. And so in order to increase donors and funding and have a product that they could sell in order to increase more revenue, they invented this lie, this marketing lie, that the pigs needed to be killed to protect the foxes. And in part, it was a lie because they claimed that the pigs were attracting golden eagles who would then eat the foxes. But in fact, the golden eagles prefer the foxes. So even if you get rid of every pig, you don't stop the golden eagles from going, and you don't stop them from killing the foxes. There's several other layers to the lie. For example, getting rid of the earlier sheep that were on there is what caused them to also call the foxes. We don't have to go through all of it. But the point is, at its core, widely admitted, it was an absolute lie that was then used to justify mass violence. And the title, The Judas Pig, comes from the fact that they hired, in essence, invasive species mercenaries from New Zealand who went through a range of violence to kill these pigs. And when nothing else worked, they took female pigs, made them be perpetually in heat, put trackers on them, sent them out to attract the other pigs, and then came through with helicopters and sharpshooters to shoot down the pigs on the island and managed to kill over 5,000 pigs in only 2 days. And so the fundamental argument is that this idea of nature is actually being produced by mass human violence, because what they're fighting for isn't natural at all. What is actually natural is diversity and change and species coming in, and trying to create some artificial Disneyland image is only achieved by mass violence at every stage. That's the essential argument of the chapter.
I'd like to add two things from this chapter that I think are really important too. One is, he points out that Michael Pollan and everyone else use this area. Michael Pollan this is also in Voss's chapter, has this original article that later on he developed the omnivore's dilemma of from the New York Times. He writes it, wants to have this idea of an invasive species, writes all about this island, turned out it was fictional. He used a fictional example. He has to go, if you look in New York Times article, it's a whole correction. Oh, I'm sorry, this island doesn't exist. And then you can find him inserting basically that same chapter in his book, but he just goes and finds a different example, which is the obvious sign that this is a bad faith argument. This is not him trying to get at the real argument about if there's an intention here. He just wants this example so he can make his argument, so he can feel better about himself. So that's important. And then to follow up on the Judas pig part, right? So what they're doing is they're weaponizing the sociality of animals. If other animals didn't have fellow feeling, if they didn't want to hang out with each other, if they weren't concerned about the cries of animals in distress, if they didn't socialize, then obviously you couldn't have Judas pigs and Judas goats that they use against these other animals. They use the very fact that these animals are social beings, that they come together in community, and they weaponize it in order to kill them, sort of like the notorious double tap of drone strikes, where drones will go send an initial attack, and then rescuers will come in, and then they will shoot a second attack in, because people respond in distress to the harm of our fellow human beings. They weaponize our own sociality against us. And so the part of what's being done here is only successful because these animals because we are animals too, and because they share our finite, precarious life of wanting to be in community with each other. And that's one of the ways they're able to use this. So I just wanted to say one other thing. So since writing the book, I started working on this article. I've delivered it as a conference talk a couple of times. I'm still working on it. One of the distressing things that I've discovered about the kind of racism involved with the species discourse around non-native species is that there's these very, very famous white supremacist terrorists and shooters, most famously the Queensland Park one, but also people who've shot people in Buffalo, New York, and all sorts of other places. And they've left behind these manifestos. And I, for whatever reason, I now cannot remember why someone told me I needed to read the Queensland Shooter Manifesto now. But someone said, Skew, you have to read this. And I was like, that's very distressing. Okay. But why they wanted me to read it is the Queensland shooter self-identifies as an eco-fascist. He says that the reason he is doing this is not because he's a conservative. He rejects that label, rejects Trump, whatever. He says he is an eco-fascist and that he is trying to save humanity from environmental concerns, and that the problems that are going on are problems of overpopulation and we now know, we now talk about the Great Replacement theory, right? Which is this right-wing white supremacist conspiracy theory that white people are having less babies and non-white people are having more babies, and the white race will be greatly replaced. Anyway, so this is this notion. And he cites, the Queensland shooter cites specifically stuff about invasive species as his justification for going and shooting and killing all of these people. He is claiming to do the same work that bringing in these shooters to shoot the pigs are doing. That's what he's claiming. And several other white supremacist shooters since then have also left manifestos. Not all of them, but many of them have left manifestos identifying with the Queensland shooter, identifying as eco-fascist, and claiming that this is the work they're doing. They are claiming that the reason they are doing this is because of invasion ecology. And is a mind-boggling claim in many ways, but it is. So I'm working on this article right now that begins off with Tay Roosevelt and the Crockett-Boone Club and the original anti-eugenics laws that are passed in the United States, in which Tay Roosevelt wanted to preserve the great America in order to protect the manly art of the rifle, as he says, against non-white people, and then this continuation since then of justifying xenophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric with this argument of maintaining a pristine, natural world and the current terrorism of white supremacists.
We'll pause here and listen to Uda Afternoon 1 by Matthew Gerstenberger and Chiako, after which we'll return with more from James and Vasile Stănescu. We're back for the second part of the Stănescu's brothers' invasion ecology. Thank you so much for that. And I found both of your pieces extremely compelling, intellectually, but also completely surprising. I had no idea about the manufactured, it was not Whittington Island, but something like that, and the completely manufactured, put in the New York Times, which is, and then no editorial fact checking, which is also surprising, not surprising, but whatever. We'll leave that aside. But also the level of targeted violence and the sort of like a premeditation, like studying your victim to the extent that you then, as you said, you weaponize their own being, which is it's pernicious and so incredibly disturbing. I mean, and yes, of course, I get the argument. We do that we do unspeakable violence to billions of animals every year. We're talking here about a specifically small population, but I think that's emblematic of the sorts of things that we do. So I think it's important to talk about even that, And it's also interesting how you said, that's that one example that creates this tension, and then basically cutting off any discussion that could have happened had this manufactured tension not been ushered into the room. So what do you think about that? A missed opportunity that we could have actually had a conversation.
Exactly. So there's so much there. So as you and James have already highlighted, Michael Pollan publishes this exact same argument in the New York Times, but based on a fictitious island. And then when he gets called out, all he does is basically cut and paste the island. And he gets rid of the fictitious island and he puts in Santa Cruz. And in the article that he's even reading to make the fictitious argument, in those articles, they make this admission that it was a marketing ploy. So even the second time, it is not the case that he doesn't understand that this is an untrue argument and a marketing ploy. It is that he is going to make this argument no matter what, which suggests, as James says, that it is a bad faith argument. The argument comes first and the facts come later. And he's just finding facts to support this argument. So what is this argument? It is a belief that eating meat is natural. And it doesn't seem to matter how much peer-reviewed data we stack to point out that what would be better in terms of stable ecologies would be eating less meat or no meat at all. People who believe it is natural keep making this argument on an understanding of nature, not based on peer-reviewed data, but on some sort of like telos of being from like God down, that Aristotle has made it this way. And that what seems to motivate at least Michael Pollan argument or some of these locavore arguments where they believe what they're doing is natural, and since it is natural, they have to find an example to prove it, even if no such example exists. I'll make a second point. This is your point about how we actually care about these animals. So when you look through Pro Hunt International, the way they justify being so massively violent in such a short period of time is because people will care about the animals and be distressed at the slaughter. And so they say, hey, we have to really amp up the slaughter to make sure that people caring doesn't get in our way. And so oddly, the people doing this violence, their claim is not that humans don't care about animals, but that we have to be extra violent precisely because we do.
Yeah, exactly. Which then reminds me of something that I've come across when I've had discussions. So let me just take a step back. So at our rewilding project, we are up in the Highlands in Scotland, and one of the discussions that always comes up is the number of deer that make it very difficult for forests to regenerate, because the deer don't eat the Sitka spruce, which is the commercially planted tree that came from the Northwest Americas, and that's planted in the highlands and in other places. They don't eat that. There's loads of that. But anything else that's growing, they prefer it. So, people say, oh, there are too many deer, which is whatever. But in terms of the numbers, in terms of sheer numbers, we're talking there are 2 to 3 million deer in the entirety of Britain and about 33 million sheep in the entirety of Britain. And the sheep here in Britain, they roam the hills. They are most of them are free, and they wander around the hills browsing on a variety of plants and grasses and et cetera. And so just even from numbers, you see the disparity. Then one of the things that I was always keen to find out is, well, okay, does shooting deer to curtail the numbers or to reduce the numbers, does it actually work? And I've talked to lots of people, and they've said no, it doesn't, because either deer move in from the other, deer know that there's other deer, and so they don't go there. But then when they see that there aren't deer, then others come in and they take their place, and so on. And then also, interestingly, and always in questions of animal use, there's always the human factor. And the human factor is there are some of these guys that have been killing deer on a variety of estates or conservation areas for like 20 years, and they all have PTSD. All of them. They all have PTSD. So when I was reading the truly just astonishing 5,000 number, over 5,000, something like almost 5,200 number that you cited of the pigs killed on the island, you also have to think about there's people doing that. How are they? Are they okay with all this? And to some extent, some of these, this is what they do. This is what they know how to do. This is their living. And we're okay doing that to them?
Well, this ties into James's point about this kind of military rhetoric that is used throughout. That's why I call them almost like invasive species mercenaries.
Yeah, and I love that term.
I mean, even in the term invading from, right? It's a war, right. Invading. There's all these different terms we could use.
Yeah.
Why did we choose the least accurate? And how is invasive a scientific? I've debated biologists at Stanford on this topic, and they use the term invasive.
Everyone uses that
sort
term.
of determines your conclusion once you framed it that way. James, did you want to say? Yeah.
Many people point out that invasive ecology makes it sound like if you're engaged in this work, if you're an invasion biologist or whatever, you're basically the same at this point as people trying to cure cancer. You've already said this is the problem, right? And my goal is to destroy this thing, and that's not normally how we carry out scientific research, right? And yet this is indeed how we've carried out this sort of scientific research. And no, I think you're absolutely right about the question of these people who are involved in so much massive violence against other animals.
We know exactly.
We know for a fact that so many of the people who work in factory farms suffer lifelong psychological damage. And again, I'm sorry to go back to but most of the people who work in factory farms in the United States are themselves migrant workers. Many of them undocumented, many of them without access to other kinds of jobs. And so we are, at least in this case, with factory farms, we're bringing in people who are already often exploited, very exploitable, making them do labor that is both physically destructive to their bodies. The highest rates of employee composition claims come from factory farms in the United States, but also are psychologically damaging. And we're only now beginning to realize the extent of that sort of truth. when people ask me why I'm opposed to the factory farm, I go, all the reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, right? Like, where you got the environmental reasons, the labor reasons, the reasons about how we treat other animals. I mean, it is, there's no justification for something like that. But yeah, because there's no justification, we end up sometimes in these weird places where people have come up with, I'm going to talk about pigs on Santa Cruz Island, and somehow that's going to justify how we can continue to eat other animals. And, that's not...
No.
It doesn't make any real sense, but that's how the arguments work.
But even the term, so even when we're saying native species, and so native and then invasive, right? So,
right. The terms have defined the debate.
They defined the debate. And I mean, again, I'm going to just go back to Scotland for a second. Some of the deer species were introduced by the Normans. So it wasn't, and it's not like they didn't come here. They didn't like walk over or swim, and some of them were also brought over from Japan, all because the people then, we wanted them here for our own enjoyment, for whatever.
What if we called them immigrant species? What if we called them colonized species? How does that change?
Exactly.
They're the ones choosing to invade into the space as these aggressors against
Central
these defensive
Command.
Natives. Sorry, go ahead.
Exactly, like Central Command deer, Central Command pigs. Let's go in. But exactly. I mean, but yet, I find, and I also find myself using those terms because those are the terms that people speak in. So you kind of, I don't have a better term because, I can make one up, but then I'm going to have to define it. And then, people are going to say, oh, you mean invasive species?
When we did the book, we went through all of the various terms. And we kept invasion as part of the title for exactly this reason, but also within the book, I'm not, non-native, that's not great. Alien species, that's not great. Introduced, that's a popular one. I like that a little bit. But yeah, none of them are very good. It also is confusing too because oftentimes our discussions here are very muddled because it truly is nothing to do with nature, nothing to do with nativity. So think back to 2020, a terrible year. One of the apocalyptic headlines, at least here in the United States, was about the Japanese killer hornets, the Asian killer hornets. I don't know how much attention that got elsewhere, but there were these non-native Japanese hornets that had been discovered in Washington state, and they've never been called killer hornets before. This was something the New York Times invented and then pretended they didn't invent. I don't know what to say. It could have been a translation error. Right? I don't know. But I did look into this enough to know that it was they've never been called killer hornets ever before the New York Times said, these killer hornets, well known in Japan. But the fear of them was that they would kill European honeybees, whose name might imply are also not native to the United States. So this was this fear that you would have these killer hornets going and wiping out the European honeybee. And so you're like, okay, well, this is the war of one non-native against another, right? I mean, so we use this language of nativity, but that's not what we mean. We mean something like pest species, right? I mean, white-tailed deer here are native to the United States, and people, hunt them and talk about the need to control their population just as if they are non-native. Most of our, usually when you see concerns about non-native species, frequently it's just questions of economics. Your fishing is going to change and people don't want to pay as much for this kind of fish, or, right? So it's not really so much about preserving nature. It's usually a question of some kind of economic harm. Oh, are these Japanese hornets going to decrease European honeybees? And we use, people rent out the honeybees for trying to pollinate various kinds of monocultural agriculture here in the United States, and that's an economic question. But it really isn't a question of nature or natural harm. That is something people talk about to justify often great kinds of violences and extreme kinds of policies, but that's usually not what the concern is. It's usually a very narrow economic concern, or a concern, like Voss pointed out, that's both economic, but also this idea of like a pristine Disneyland version of nature.
Yeah,
or something,
that the whole pristine is also, yes, hugely problematic in so many ways. What I want to ask both of you is, and you talk about this, James, in your piece, where you bring in how we might change the way that we relate to other animals and with other animals, and frankly also between and among ourselves, the human animals. And you talk about a cosmopolitan parliament and pluralism, and I'm hoping that you will both talk a little bit about that, so we can. We've seen all the various issues, or at least we've touched on them briefly, because we could go on forever. But how do we overcome that? What do we think about? Where do we go, or where can we think about going?
So I do talk about that in my article in the book. I'm influenced here by thinkers like Isabel Stinger and Gil Deleuze, who are not normally talking about animals per se, though sometimes they do. But I am interested in how is it that we learn to live together. Hannah Arendt, in her discussion of Eichmann, says that his sin was that he was going to decide who he could share the earth with. Right? So his sin was he has decided who gets to be his fellow earthlings. Now, she means this in a kind of anthropocentric way, but when I read that, I realized that really is the problem here. We are making a decision, right? Like Eichmann, though I don't want, I'm not making an analogy.
No dreaded comparison here.
We are making decisions about who we get to share the earth with. And really, what we need is a reality that we are shared earthlings. We're precarious, vulnerable beings on this earth together, and we need to figure out a way to make a promise of a future together on our rapidly heating, vastly changing sort of planet. We're in this really deeply together. And when we forget that, we get to justify all sorts of harms to cut off and destroy the parts of the earth we decide and the sorts of people we decide we don't want to share the earth with anymore. And so for me, this cosmopolitan parliament is one way of thinking, one way of talking about this kind of concern. How do we come together as earthlings together? Which is going to be hard.
Absolutely.
I mean, right? Anthropocentrism might be something we can't escape, but that doesn't mean it is something we shouldn't strive against. And we can certainly begin to build institutions. We can certainly begin to build affects. We can certainly begin to build artifice that expand our sympathies, expand our empathies, and broaden our understanding of what an us could be. And so those are the sorts of questions I really am more concerned about these days in sort of my current life and role as a communications scholar.
Yeah, I think that is
Thoughts?
Brilliant and exactly right on. And completely aligned with my own thoughts. And part of why I was so glad to be part of this project, because I think, as James mentioned earlier, what underlines all of this is a kind of commitment to fascism. And that, hence the eco-fascism. So choosing who lives and dies, which lives are unworthy of life, is the fascist idea. Yeah. And we're not making any kind of comparisons, as we've already talked to, but we're just learning from history. And so it is unsurprising to me that an earlier logic of invasion and invasive species is then taken and used against human animals as well, in a similar kind of misuse of term of invasion of the immigrants, and we have to fight against them because these same mistakes were there in the original invasive species idea against non-human animals. I mean, I think that's really what James's book is kind of gesturing towards, and I think that's exactly right. From Hobbes to our modern discourse, there's this logic that we are at war with animals, that we are at war with the natural world. Well, that is cutting off your nose to spite your face. I mean, we are in this together. So the term I like to use is solidarity. We have to be in solidarity with non-human animals. We have to be in solidarity, not that our interests are identical, but that they're aligned, and we have to celebrate and fight with them to make real change. That is what I believe. That is what I'm trying to argue for all the time. And I also like it because animals have a way of coming together to make change, which has leader as a verb, but not a position. So you think, or a title. So you think like a school of fish. There's a fish that's in front that's making that whole school, but he's not in charge of that group. That group is just fighting together. Leader is a verb, not a noun. And if another fish can do a better job and comes up, that becomes the new leader. And that's how I think, as people who believe in animal liberation, we have to organize. Not leaderless, but leader as a verb. Not, okay, so-and-so has this title, but as a collective, as a pack, as a group, as a school that are all working together, taking turns based on expertise about who is the new leader, to be in solidarity, fighting together to make real practical change against increasingly what we see, which is the other option, fascism. That's what I believe.
That's a perfect place to stop, because I completely agree with both of you. And again, thank you so much, James and Vasile. Before we go, where can people follow your work? And do you have any projects you'd like to promote?
James, why don't you go?
Yeah, sure. I still occasionally blog at criticalanimal.com. Not as much as I would like, but that is how I got started pushing
Not as much as he
work out there.
should.
And
I love his blog. He should
it.
blog more. Sorry, go ahead, James.
Yeah. So you can still find, and from criticalanimal.com, you can find all of there's links to publications and everything else from there. It's as close as I have to a professional website as well.
My partner, Devs, created a website and a podcast. The name of the website is How We Win, Achieving Animal Liberation in Our Lifetime. And it has links to all of my works and talks. In addition, Devs has created a podcast about how we win. We have monthly episodes where we talk about these issues and occasionally have guests. It would be great for people to listen or to reach out to us with thoughts to change. And I have two projects that are in the works. So one is a talk or a linkage between particularly factory farms and capitalism. And I'm actually working with James on this based on our shared interest and background. And so I will be giving a talk about this, about how we win in Barcelona this summer at the Compassionate Futures Conference. So if anyone is in Spain or listening or in Europe and would like to come, I would love to see you there. The whole family will be there. Devs, our son Tavi will all be there together. You can hang out with all of us as we vegan out. And our hope with James and I is that we're going to work together to get this published and this out there on slaughterhouse capitalism. How capitalism is based on the slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
And the slaughterhouse has been true.
We're trying to finalize, hopefully, a book on this work of slaughterhouse capitalism. And it's been a lot of fun being able to walk over to his office. He has a bigger office. Walk over to his office and work on this. And so hopefully we'll have more concrete details about this
as ideas develop.
Pretty soon.
That's right.
Oh, this is great, and I'll be sure to put all the links in the show notes. Once again, thank you, Vasile. Thank you, James. I really appreciate this, and it's been so thought-provoking and so hopeful too.
If you don't mind, let me add with one note.
Of course.
I just want to thank each of you. We have pretty good data on why people go vegan, and we have pretty good data on why they leave. And overwhelmingly is they feel that they are not appreciated, and that what they're doing is not making a difference. And it is. And I am just so grateful for each of you and for all of your listeners. There's nothing in the world that we can do individually that is more important than going vegan and helping to liberate animals. And I just want to thank all of you.
Well, thank you.
When we go round, we burn things up. When we go round, we speed things up. When we go round.
That's it from me, Emilise. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com if you have questions, comments, or want to suggest a guest or a topic for discussion. I'd be happy to hear from you. And you can find more of my work and upcoming events on my website, emilialise.com, and on Substack and on social media. And buy a copy of Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks, or request it from your library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashbacks, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.